Hello and welcome to Tank and AFV News. My name's Tom, and today we are taking a look at Designing the T-34, Genesis of the Revolutionary Soviet Tank by Peter Samsonov. This one just came out. I got a couple days ago in the mail, and I've been looking forward to this one. This is the first book by Peter Samsonov. Now, for people who are familiar with the Tank Archives blog, that is his. He has been doing that for quite a few years. It used to be called Archive Awareness, now it's Tank Archive blog. And he is a Canadian Russian so he speaks and reads Russian fluently, and the crux of his blog is to take Russian and some other countries, primarily Russian archival information documents, and then translate them into English. Stuff dealing with tanks, particularly World War II tanks. He also will take Russian language articles on tanks and translate them. So in particular, like quite a few from Yuri Pashaluk, who's one of the more prominent Russian researchers right now. So I would definitely recommend checking out his website. I've been following it for years, trying to promote it on my own website when I was keeping that current. So definitely worth looking into. Also, one of the very first people I ever did a Q&A on my website with was Peter. So that one's quite a few years old, but if you want to go find that, I'll put a link to it in this video description. So this is his first book, and it's the first book I've had a chance to see from this Gallantry Books is the imprint on it, from Morton Books in the UK. And it is, as you can see, appearance-wise, very similar in size, actually identical in size to a new Osprey New Vanguard title, which is probably something familiar to most people who watch this channel. If you're into tanks and you've been to a hobby shop, you've seen these. They usually always have a big rack of them. And in fact, you can even see if you look at the backs of them, it's almost like they're kind of trying to copy the Osprey a little bit. That said, though, the books, this new T-34 book is a bit different. So the main one being that there's a lot more information in here because there's a lot more pages. So this has, whereas a new Vanguard title has 48 pages, this has 91. Now that comes at the cost of the paper's a bit thinner, so you have to be a little more careful. It's not thin to the point of being strangely thin. It's just these Osprey titles, the pages are pretty rugged. The paper quality itself, it's nice. The photo quality reproduction's nice. It looks great. So again, it's not a complaint. I'm just saying the paper's thinner. The good news is you get a lot more because the original description said this was like a 90-page book. When I opened it up, I'm like, well, it's not quite as big as I thought. But once you start reading it, you realize there's a lot of information in here. It is got plenty of photographs. I would say probably just as well as some color illustrations. So you can see here's a few of them. But most of the book is sort of your standard partially print, partly photos. I would say about 60-40 text versus photos as far as the actual real estate on the pages. And a lot of the photos being provided by the author himself. So that's sort of nice because a lot of ones you haven't seen before. And so as far as the content of the book itself, this is a much narrower topic than some of the other books that have written on the T-34 because he's only looking at, as the title implies, designing the T-34. He's looking at the developmental period, so sort of from the mid to late 30s up until the tank goes into production in 1940 or so. So he's really diving into the weeds of the sort of politics of Soviet design and procurement in that period, and the different things going on as far as vehicle development in the Soviet Union, sort of starting with the A-20 and working through the different iterations, up to like A-32 and then or T-32, T-34, and really getting into sort of a lot of the nuts and bolts of that. So I read through this. A lot of this was information that I probably had not read before. For one thing, it's a little hard to keep track of all the names and figures just because I'm more familiar with U.S. tank development than Soviet tank development, and it's a very information dense book. So the nice thing also, because he has spent so much time delving into the archives, is able to present some of the things he's found, like some of the armor testing they did, ballistic testing they did as this tank was developed. So you can see here, the T-34 turret shot full of holes as they're testing it. So some of the stuff that you're not going to know if you haven't spent the time digging through the archives. If you're just writing a book on the T-34 based on what other people have written, using the same information. This obviously is not that. He's gone out and found a lot of original stuff, and that's nice. Because here's the thing about the T-34 that's kind of interesting. It's probably one of the most important tanks ever designed. Certainly one of the most important tanks of the Second World War, which, of course, is one of the most important events of the 20th century. So you would think that there's a lot out there on it, and there's not quite as much as in English as you might assume. Now, partly this was because, during the Cold War itself, it's not like there's stuff coming out of the Soviet Union. They weren't publishing well-researched, objective books on their own history and then releasing those in the West. It's just not how things work. So, the only people writing on this stuff are Western writers, or, people who are, or have information sources in Eastern Europe, whatever, that are trying to get a handle on this stuff. The first major book I know of that really deals with Soviet history, armored history, was John Milson's Russian Tanks, 1900 to 1970. The title gives you an idea of when this book was published. This book's quite old, and I would not rely on it. It's a fun book to look through. I would not rely on it because, obviously, being that old, it's got some errors in it and whatnot. But for the time, it was one of the best things out there. Then you get into the 80s. By the late 80s, you had the Soviet Tanks and Combat Vehicles of World War II book by Zaloga and Granson, and this was quite a jump forward in what we had available in English on Soviet tanks. Zaloga, of course, one of the primary writers on Russian vehicles in that time period. And then, after that, you see a lot of, smaller books. Obviously, like I said, Zaloga did this New Osprey title. There's a lot of other kind of, more photo-oriented books. Things like the SSP series, or, there are a few different, I think, some Polish publications that also may have gotten translated in English. More recently, there was, this Haynes manual came out just a year or two ago. But overall, not as far as really in-depth, serious books with new material. There wasn't a lot. The place where there is a lot of new material on the T-34 coming out is in Russia itself, because since the end of the Soviet Union, the archives have been made much more available, more so to Russian citizens than to Western researchers. Access for Western researchers seems to vary and fluctuate depending on East-West relations at any particular time. And while there have been quite a few books published, not all of them get translated, or I would say most of them don't get translated in English. The one exception is, there's this one on the T-34 by Barry Atinsky, who's written quite a few books on Russian armor that I picked up a few years ago. So this one by Samsonov is interesting because, like I said, he's got sources that are providing him with this archival material, but he's writing in English and living in Canada. So it's kind of interesting that this fills a nice niche that hadn't been filled. Most books that cover the T-34, this sort of design period is going to be covered like in the first chapter. It's going to get a few pages. If you want that section of the book expanded out to an entire book of 90 pages, this is for you. So, yeah, this definitely gets a thumbs up. It is, again, it's always nice to see something that's presenting new information, that's filling in a niche that really hadn't been filled in completely before. So, it's not just a regurgitation of, things we've seen before, the same sources. And he does, of course, provide pretty extensive notes, and in the back, in case you're curious as to where he's finding this information. And of course, you can always go to his website, because there's going to be a lot of stuff there in terms of the kind of archival stuff he likes to dig through. So that's what I've got to say about designing the T-34. In case I didn't mention, it is $19.99. You can buy it directly from mortonbooks.co.uk, or Amazon. I believe Casemate will be carrying this one as well. So thank you, and we will see you on the next one.